Teenagers have always faced difficulties, but in the medieval period, growing up involved not merely discovering oneself, but managing to endure long enough to do so. The norms were distinct and the expectations were considerable. If your image of medieval teenagers involves them relaxing in magnificent stone castles, prepare to have that notion shattered. The reality of medieval dwellings was considerably less glamorous. Let's explore the actual living conditions of these adolescents. For the vast majority, home consisted of a single-room wooden dwelling constructed with wattle and daub, essentially a mixture of mud, sticks, and straw. Archaeological discoveries in medieval London reveal that the typical home measured roughly 400 square feet. Now, envision sharing that limited area with your parents, siblings, and occasionally even livestock. Describing it as cozy barely scratches the surface. Speaking of limited space, let's talk about where everyone slept. Recall the scene in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where all four grandparents occupied the same bed. That depiction was surprisingly accurate for medieval times, excluding the Chocolate Factory, of course. Most families shared a single elevated sleeping area, or bed platform. By platform, I mean a slightly elevated wooden surface covered with straw. Those fortunate few had a mattress filled with wool, while others made do with just the straw. And yes, this arrangement included the teenagers, who slept directly alongside their parents and siblings. Privacy was not even a recognized concept in the 14th century. Some houses housed as many as 8 individuals in that single room. Teenagers lacked their own spaces to slam doors or play loud music. The closest approximation to privacy was possibly concealing oneself behind the family cow, if one was lucky enough to have livestock dwelling inside the home. The living situation was quite literally room and board. Many teenagers slept on actual wooden planks. If you're curious about comfort levels, recent analyses of medieval skeletons indicate that many individuals developed early arthritis due to sleeping on such rigid surfaces. On the plus side, at least you didn't risk tumbling out of bed. Now let's discuss everyone's least favorite housemates: rats. Medieval homes were essentially a rodents all-you-can-eat buffet. Numerous complaints exist regarding rat infestations, and some households even kept specific sticks near their beds to fend off nighttime visitors. Teenagers were frequently assigned the task of catching rats, which perhaps explains why cats eventually became such favorite pets. The heating system typically involved a fire pit positioned in the center of the room, with smoke intended to exit through an opening in the roof, or at least attempting to escape. A significant portion of the smoke simply lingered indoors, coating everything and everyone in varying shades of gray. Consider it the world's first indoor smoking lounge, without the option to decline participation. Archaeological evidence suggests that many medieval teenagers suffered from respiratory ailments, a hardly surprising consequence given their living conditions were akin to residing inside a chimney. Windows were simply openings in the walls, generally covered with wooden shutters or, for the affluent, translucent animal horn. Glass windows were so prohibitively expensive that some nobles would actually transport their windows with them when relocating to different residences. One lord reportedly spent more on a single glass window than he did on a year's supply of bread for his entire household. Talk about misplaced priorities. The floor was usually composed of packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes for added warmth. These rushes would be replaced, well, let's just say not frequently enough. Occasionally, they would remain for months, accumulating food scraps, dirt, and substances one would prefer not to contemplate. It was like having a compost heap for a carpet. A recorded complaint from the past describes a neighbor accusing another of neglecting to replace their rushes for an entire year, resulting in an unbearable odor that afflicted the whole street. Accessing water presented another daily challenge. Most homes lacked private wells, necessitating teenagers often undertaking treks to the nearest water source multiple times each day. Did you know some individuals had to walk up to half a mile each way just to fetch water? That's right, no running water unless you count running to get it. The bathroom situation was, shall we say, inventive. Most houses had a designated corner or a pot, while slightly more sophisticated homes might feature an outdoor privy. Some medieval towns even enacted regulations specifying the minimum distance one's privy could be located from a neighbor's house, typically around 2 feet. Nothing quite says, "Hello, neighbor," like that arrangement. As the morning light filtered through those horn-covered window openings, another day in the life of a medieval teenager was poised to begin. The crowing of the rooster signified one thing for medieval adolescents: time to get moving. While contemporary teens might grumble about taking out the trash, medieval youths were already well into their morning chores before that rooster had even finished clearing its throat. In farming families, the day commenced with milking, extensive milking. Records from a 14th century English dairy farm indicate that a single teenage worker could milk up to 12 cows twice daily, totaling 24 encounters with the business end of a cow every single day. Most teens today can barely tolerate a disapproving glance from a younger sibling, but dairy duty was just the preliminary phase. Fieldwork presented the real challenge. A discovered wage record from 1374 reveals that teenage laborers were expected to plow an acre of land per day, roughly the size of a modern football field. The catch? They accomplished this with wooden plows and recalcitrant oxen. No tractors, no power steering, just raw teenage strength and likely an abundance of creative medieval expletives. The demands weren't any less stringent for teenagers residing in urban centers. As apprentices, they would rise at dawn within their master's home, where they typically resided for approximately 7 years. An apprenticeship contract from York outlined the daily responsibilities of a 14-year-old blacksmith's apprentice: stoking the forge before sunrise, hammering metal throughout the day, cleaning the workshop, and tending to his master's horses. In exchange, he received room, board, training, and occasionally a disciplinary tap on the ear if he made a mistake. Speaking of errors, the consequences were surprisingly significant in legal terms. Boys as young as 12 could be fined for performing their work poorly. One unfortunate teenage baker's apprentice was compelled to forfeit a week's wages for burning a batch of bread, a truly expensive cooking lesson. Girls were not idle either. Spinning wool was a ceaseless task that many began learning from the age of 6. By their teenage years, they were expected to spin enough wool to provide clothing for the entire household. A proficient teenage spinner could produce approximately 2,400 feet of yarn daily, nearly half a mile of medieval thread. Try untangling that. Household chores took on an entirely different dimension for medieval girls. We're not discussing loading a dishwasher here. They prepared meals from scratch, starting with grinding grain into flour. A typical teenage girl would grind enough grain each morning to feed a family of 6. The miller's daughter might have had an easier time of it, but she likely developed a permanent aversion to wheat. Laundry day presented another challenge. Without running water, teenagers had to transport water from wells or rivers. Heated over fires they built themselves, and then scrub clothes using homemade lye soap that could strip the skin from your hands if not handled carefully. Historical accounts suggest that a single laundry day could consume up to 50 gallons of water, a considerable number of trips to the well, especially considering those homes we discussed lacked efficient plumbing. Childcare was another significant responsibility. By age 13, many girls were practically managing the household nursery. Medieval records indicate families often had 6 to 8 children, with the older teenagers responsible for supervising the younger ones. One account from a 15th century household book mentions a 15-year-old girl overseeing 4 younger siblings while her mother worked in the fields. And you thought babysitting your cousin for an afternoon was demanding. For teenagers working as servants in affluent households, the duties were unending. A servant's list of tasks included cleaning chambers, serving food, caring for their master's clothing, and even carving their employer's meat at meals. Contracts explicitly stipulated they must be swift of foot and ready of limb, medieval terminology for no lounging allowed. The work was not solely physically demanding, it was legally binding. Employment records from the 1300s reveal that teenagers could face legal action for slacking off or attempting to flee their duties. One 14-year-old boy in Canterbury was fined 3 days' wages for taking an unauthorized nap during working hours. The next time someone labels today's teenagers as lazy, remember that at least they aren't being sued for catching a few winks. Some positions did offer advantages, however. Apprentice cooks often received additional food portions, and young servants in noble residences occasionally inherited hand-me-down clothing from their masters. One fortunate teenage apprentice in London inherited his master's entire business after demonstrating exceptional skill in metalwork, a true medieval rags-to-riches narrative. Street vendors were frequently young teenagers, selling everything from needles to shoelaces. They developed quite the reputation for employing creative sales techniques. Medieval authorities actually enacted laws restricting how loudly they could hawk their merchandise. You could argue they were the original Instagram influencers. The physical strain of all this labor was evident in medieval skeletal remains. Many teenage skeletons exhibit signs of early-onset arthritis and worn-down joints. However, all this hard work cultivated a certain resilience. Those calloused hands from farm work and trade labor proved useful when disagreements needed resolution. Both individuals ended up in the stocks for a day, likely still arguing about the quality of the yeast. But these weren't just spontaneous scuffles. Medieval towns had their own teenage gangs, complete with designated territories and reputations. In 1345, officials in Norwich complained about a group identifying themselves as the Lads of St. Augustine's, who controlled an entire street. Their most notable offense? Throwing rotten vegetables at anyone wearing expensive clothing. Not exactly the Peaky Blinders, but they made their point. The real action often occurred at festivals and fairs. Numerous accounts detail teenage brawls during summer festivals. One memorable case involved 30 teenagers fighting over who would lead the harvest dance. The victor received a black eye and the dubious honor of choosing his dance partner first. Romance wasn't dead, it just had a few bruises. For noble boys, fighting was, quite literally, a component of their education. Military training commenced around age 7 with wooden swords. By 14, they were practicing with actual weaponry. A training manual outlines exercises for teenage squires, including one charming instruction: when struck, strike back harder, but mind your master's son, he bruises easily. The path to knighthood was brutal. Young nobles spent years serving as squires, learning combat while assisting experienced knights. Their daily regimen included weapons practice, horseback riding, and enduring repeated falls into the mud. One knight described his squire as eager in battle, though still falls off his horse when sneezing. Everyone has to start somewhere. Tournament training was particularly intense. Mock battles called bohords allowed teenagers to practice group fighting. Think of it as a medieval mosh pit, but with more armor and fewer band t-shirts. Records indicate these could become quite heated. One squire lost 2 teeth during practice. His reaction? He immediately re-entered the fray after spitting them out. But it wasn't solely fun and games. When actual wars erupted, teenagers found themselves on real battlefields. During the 100 Years' War, soldiers as young as 15 fought alongside adults. One French chronicle mentions a 16-year-old squire who captured 3 English soldiers. He likely never had to purchase his own drinks at the tavern after that. Peasant teenagers were not excluded from the action. When raiders threatened their villages, everyone participated in the defense. Farm tools were repurposed as weapons. Pitchforks, scythes, and flails proved surprisingly effective. A manor court roll commends 5 teenage farmhands who defended their village using only harvesting tools and, reportedly, remarkable aim with horse manure. Town defense was taken seriously. Many cities mandated that teenagers practice archery every Sunday. This wasn't merely for leisure. English law actually prohibited other sports on Sundays to ensure young people honed their bow skills. Records from one town show they distributed free beer to the most accomplished young archers, a practice that likely boosted morale more than accuracy. Girls weren't simply spectators either. While they weren't typically trained for combat, they learned self-defense techniques. In 1401, a teenage girl successfully repelled 2 would-be robbers using a cooking spit. The judge ruled in her favor and suggested the robbers seek an easier target, like maybe a bear. Castle defense often fell to the teenagers residing there. During sieges, they would assist in manning the walls, hurling rocks at attackers, and relaying messages between defenders. An account book from one castle lists payments made to 3 teenage messengers who infiltrated enemy lines during a siege. Their secret? Pretending to be simple shepherds, complete with a few borrowed sheep for added authenticity. Perhaps the most unusual battlefield advantage exploited was teenagers' voices. Several military manuals mention utilizing squires' breaking voices to confuse enemy troops about the number of defenders. One commander wrote that his teenage troops' battle cries sounded like a dozen cats fighting in a barrel, which he regarded as a tactical benefit. Even religious institutions participated in physical training. Monastery records show teenage novices practicing wrestling to strengthen both body and spirit. One abbot wrote that he encouraged wrestling matches because it tired them out enough to sit still during prayers. Medieval problems often required uniquely medieval solutions. All that fighting certainly worked up an appetite, and medieval teens were also expected to present themselves well. However, their fashion choices were not solely about appearance. They were literally governed by law. Yes, you heard that correctly. Actual regulations dictating what one could and could not wear, known as sumptuary laws. Violating these laws meant not just committing a fashion faux pas, but potentially facing real fines or even spending time in the stocks. Let's examine what teens typically wore. For most young people, clothing was quite basic. Records for medieval wardrobes indicate that the average teenager owned perhaps 2 outfits, one for everyday wear and one for special occasions. And by special occasions, I mean anything from attending church to weddings or that infrequent festival where one might actually encounter an attractive peer. These ensembles weren't exactly designer labels. Most teens wore rough wool during the winter and linen in the summer, dyed in whatever colors their families could afford, usually browns, grays, or a particularly unappealing shade of yellowish green derived from using onion skins as dye. However, things become more interesting when considering how teenagers, then as now, were remarkably creative within limited options. Young individuals would add imaginative patches to their clothes, not merely to repair holes, but to create decorative patterns. Some particularly fashion-conscious teens would even trade small pieces of colorful fabric to augment their outfits. Medieval DIY fashion at its finest. In 1387, a group of teenage girls were reprimanded for exchanging strips of red cloth they had taken from their mother's dresses to make their own clothing more vibrant. The realm of medieval accessories was surprisingly intricate. Belts held significant importance. They weren't just functional for keeping clothes in place, but served as indicators of status. Teens from merchant families might save for months to acquire a decorative belt buckle, while noble teens might possess belts adorned with silver or even gold. There's an account of a 16-year-old apprentice who exchanged 3 months of extra labor solely to obtain a bronze-decorated belt. Now, for noble teenagers, circumstances differed, though not necessarily for the better. While they had access to finer materials, they also contended with some notably uncomfortable fashion trends. Young noble girls might be required to wear headdresses that weighed several pounds, while boys had to contort themselves into tight-fitting hose that likely made sitting down a genuine challenge. And let's not even mention those exaggeratedly pointy shoes called palanes. Some were so elongated that one had to tie the tips to one's knees just to walk. The color of your clothing transcended personal preference. It constituted a language in itself. Wearing certain colors could actually lead to trouble if you weren't from the appropriate social strata. Blue was particularly tricky. Wearing the wrong shade could suggest you were attempting to pass as nobility. Did you know there's a record of a 15-year-old merchant's son who was fined for wearing a shade of blue deemed too royal for his social standing? Speaking of colors, the process of dyeing clothes was an art form in itself. Teens working as dyers' apprentices learned complex formulas for creating different hues. Red was derived from madder root, blue from woad, and yellow from weld. The most expensive dye was purple, produced from thousands of tiny sea snails. Definitely not something your average teenager could afford. Some clever young people discovered creative workarounds for these limitations, such as using layered fabrics to create the illusion of more expensive colors. Headwear was another significant element in medieval teen fashion. Boys would wear different styles of caps depending on their trade. A baker's apprentice might wear a white linen cap, while a blacksmith's apprentice might have a leather one. Girls were typically required to cover their hair once they reached a certain age, but many found imaginative ways to enhance their head coverings' fashionability. Some would embroider the edges of their veils or incorporate small decorative pins, all within the boundaries of affordability and legal constraints naturally. The changing seasons presented their own fashion challenges. Winter clothing was layered and heavy, often incorporating fur if one could afford it. Summer was more complicated. One was expected to remain covered for modesty even in the heat. Medieval teens developed clever strategies to stay cool while adhering to the rules, such as wearing loose-fitting sleeves that could be rolled up when no important figures were observing. Even shoes conveyed information about one's identity. Most teenagers wore simple leather shoes, but the style and quality varied considerably based on their family's status. A farmer's son might wear sturdy ankle boots, while a merchant's daughter might possess shoes with delicate decorative cutouts. The truly wealthy teens owned shoes in different colors, an unimaginable luxury for most young people. But maintaining a presentable appearance wasn't solely about clothing. Medieval teens had their own methods for staying clean and fresh, though their techniques might raise a few eyebrows today. Forget about a morning shower. Heating water was such a monumental chore that most teens cleaned themselves using a method known as spot washing. They would employ a damp cloth to cleanse the visible areas of their body, particularly their face and hands. The rest, well, let's just say their standards differed from ours. Teeth cleaning was surprisingly advanced. Teens would chew on fresh herbs like mint or rosemary, not just for fresh breath, but because these plants were believed to kill bacteria. They also used rough linen cloths to scrub their teeth and twigs with frayed ends as rudimentary toothbrushes. One popular dental cleaning recipe recommended combining ground sage, salt, and vinegar into a paste. Not exactly minty fresh, but it did assist in combating tooth decay. Hair care was quite the undertaking. Teens used herb-infused vinegar rinses to keep their hair clean and combat lice, a persistent challenge in medieval times. Noble teens might have access to imported soaps made with exotic oils, but most young people used simple wood ash mixed with fat to wash their hair when they could. Girls would often weave herbs into their hair, both for a pleasant scent and to deter insects. Addressing body odor was a creative process. Teens would carry small sachets of dried herbs in their pockets or sewn into their clothing. They would also rub mint or lavender leaves directly onto their skin as a medieval deodorant. Some medieval beauty manuals advise rubbing a mixture of rose water and spices on pulse points. As we conclude this look at medieval teen fashion, remember that while their clothing options may seem limited to us, these young people were grappling with many of the same concerns we face today, desiring to look good, fit in, and perhaps attract someone's attention. Marriage in medieval times was not simply about romantic affection. It encompassed matters of land, wealth, and familial alliances. Parents often commenced planning their children's marriages when they were barely old enough to walk. By the age of 12, most girls were already aware of their future spouse, regardless of their personal feelings. Boys typically had until around 14 before their destinies were sealed. One particularly disgruntled medieval father recorded in his diary, "My daughter claims she is too young to marry at 13. I was promised to her mother at 3. Yet medieval teens were not entirely powerless in affairs of the heart. Records from the 1300s are replete with stories of young people devising inventive ways to meet their romantic interests. One clever 15-year-old girl in York managed to exchange love notes with a boy by concealing them within loaves of bread she was assigned to deliver. Another teenage couple in London were discovered meeting clandestinely during church services. They would feign profound religious devotion simply to sit near each other. The church actually played a pivotal role in medieval courtship. While parents held the authority to arrange marriages, the church stipulated that both parties had to genuinely consent to the union for it to be considered valid. This led to some rather dramatic scenes. Records document instances of teenagers speaking out during their own wedding ceremonies, declaring they had been coerced into the marriage. One courageous 14-year-old boy announced during his wedding that he was already married to someone else. A revelation that surprised everyone, including his supposed first wife. The actual process of courtship was surprisingly structured. Noble teenagers were expected to adhere to strict rules regarding interactions with potential partners. They were not permitted to be alone together, could not touch, and required the presence of a chaperone at all times. This constraint led to the development of some creative dating methods. The bundling board was one such innovation. A wooden plank placed between a courting couple in bed, allowing them to converse throughout the night without physical contact. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval parents would permit teenagers to share a bed, provided a plank separated them. For commoners, courtship was somewhat less formal, but still governed by certain rules. Village festivals served as prime opportunities for young people to meet. Dancing was permitted, though with some interesting restrictions. In some locations, teenagers could only hold hands through handkerchiefs, fostering a flourishing trade in decorative hand coverings. One medieval market recorded courtship handkerchiefs as being among the most popular items sold to young people. The age disparity in medieval marriages could be quite striking by modern standards. Girls as young as 12 could be married to men in their 30s or 40s. However, there was often a caveat. Many of these marriages were not officially consummated until the girl reached the age of 14 or 15. Some resourceful teenagers used this waiting period to their advantage, finding ways to terminate undesirable engagements. One clever 13-year-old girl in medieval France successfully avoided an arranged marriage by deliberately violating every social norm she could conceive of, rendering herself so undesirable for marriage that her intended family withdrew their proposal. However, here's an interesting point. Love matches did occur even within the framework of arranged marriages. Young people often found ways to influence their parents' decisions. Some would deliberately, accidentally encounter their preferred partner at social events, generating gossip that would compel their families to consider them as a potential match. Others employed more direct tactics, such as the 15-year-old boy who persuaded his uncle to approach his crush's family about a marriage proposal, making it appear as though the idea originated with the adults all along. The concept of the dowry added another layer of complexity to medieval teenage marriage. Families often spent years meticulously saving up for their daughters' dowries, which could comprise everything from land and money to household goods and livestock. One medieval father's account book details him trading 3 cows and 2 pigs solely to acquire a suitable set of cooking pots for his daughter's dowry. After navigating the complexities of courtship and marriage, newlywed teenagers confronted their next major challenge, establishing their own household and figuring out the practicalities of living together. But before they could settle into married life, they had to grapple with the fundamental practical aspects of existence. However, in medieval times, education was not a given for every teenager. In fact, the vast majority of teens never set foot in anything remotely resembling a classroom. The ability to read and write was a privilege reserved for a minuscule fraction of the population, primarily nobles, clergy members, and occasionally the children of affluent merchants. The profound disparity in who received education was stark and nearly insurmountable. Imagine being a teenager whose entire future was determined by the mere accident of birth. Born into a peasant family, your education revolved around acquiring the skills necessary for survival through arduous labor. Born into nobility, you might actually learn to read. How fortunate! Approximately 95% of medieval teenagers received no formal education whatsoever. Instead, peasant teens learned through keen observation and practical application. A farm boy would accompany his father to the fields, learning how to plow straight furrows, when to plant specific crops, and how to care for livestock. Girls would shadow their mothers, mastering the arts of cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and managing a household. These skills were not imparted through books. They were transmitted across generations through hands-on experience. For a select minority of teenagers, usually boys destined for religious life, monastery schools provided the closest equivalent to formal education. These institutions placed a heavy emphasis on religious texts, teaching Latin, basic mathematics, and of course, theology. The daily routine in a monastery school was demanding. Wake before dawn for morning prayers, study Latin texts for several hours, practice copying manuscripts, attend more prayers, and continue studying until evening. It is safe to conclude that students were not exactly having a recreational time. A monastery in 13th century England documented punishments for boys who failed their Latin recitations. Interestingly, some girls received education in convents, although this was even less common. These schools taught religious texts alongside what were considered appropriate female skills: embroidery, basic medical care, and music. It wasn't precisely Harvard, but it offered its own advantages. For teenagers who were neither nobility nor destined for religious life, apprenticeships represented the most prevalent form of education. By age 12 or 13, many boys were sent to reside with master craftsmen to acquire skills in trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, masonry, leatherworking, weaving, and baking. The apprenticeship contract, typically signed by the parents, usually bound the teenager for 7 to 10 years. During this period, they received lodging, sustenance, and training, but generally no wages. Records indicate that approximately 60% of teenage boys in urban areas were apprentices. Teenage nobles received an education specifically tailored to prepare them for their future roles in society. Boys were trained in what we might consider the medieval preparatory school curriculum: Latin and occasionally Greek, basic mathematics, music appreciation, hunting and falconry, swordsmanship and combat, horsemanship and heraldry. Think of it as a comprehensive course in how to become a medieval powerhouse. Noble girls learned a parallel curriculum focused on household management, basic literacy, embroidery and needlework, music and dancing, proper etiquette, religious instruction, and occasionally basic medical knowledge. Only about 2% of medieval teenagers received this level of education. For them, learning extended beyond acquiring knowledge. It was about demonstrating the sophistication expected of their social class. After all, knowing Latin was insufficient if you also didn't know the correct way to curtsy. Fewer than 0.1% of all medieval teenagers ever attended university. Those who did gained significant advantages in medieval society, with many ascending to positions as advisors to kings, high-ranking church officials, or prominent physicians. It was, in essence, akin to winning the medieval lottery. Today, we take books for granted. In medieval times, each book was meticulously handcrafted through a laborious process that could span months. A single university textbook could cost as much as a small house. This meant most teenagers never saw a book in their entire lives, much less owned one. So the next time you complain about the cost of college textbooks, remember that at least they don't equal the cost of your parents' mortgage. Because books were so exceedingly valuable, students often learned through dictation and rote memorization. Imagine attempting to recall an entire semester's worth of material without any written notes. When teenagers did acquire the ability to write, they faced challenges that modern students can barely conceive. They wrote with quill pens that required constant reshaping, ink derived from oak galls, iron and gum arabic, and parchment made from animal skins that had undergone extensive scraping, stretching, and treatment, and they possessed no erasers. Mistakes necessitated starting over. The medieval equivalent of "my computer crashed and I lost my essay" was "a goat ate my parchment," and both scenarios were equally devastating. While it is true that boys received more formal education, some girls, particularly from affluent families, did acquire the ability to read and write. Approximately 5 to 10% of noble girls received some level of education, compared to 30 to 40% of noble boys. Daughters of merchants occasionally learned basic mathematics to assist with the family business. Perhaps the most profound aspect of medieval education was how effectively it reinforced existing social hierarchies. Without access to education, peasant teenagers had virtually no opportunity to transcend their station. The rare exceptions occurred when a particularly bright peasant boy was sponsored by the church. Education provided through religious institutions represented one of the few avenues for social mobility. Records from Durham Cathedral indicate that approximately 3% of the clergy originated from peasant backgrounds, having been identified as exceptionally intelligent and sponsored through education by local priests. As we transition from the world of learning to the perpetual struggle for health in medieval times, let us remember that education wasn't merely about books. It was fundamentally about learning how to survive. And speaking of survival, life for a medieval teenager was, in many respects, a continuous battle against illness and injury. Unlike today, medieval teens confronted threats from the moment they awakened until they went to sleep, if they were fortunate enough to awaken at all. Falling ill in medieval times was not just an inconvenience. It was often a life-threatening event for teenagers who were just beginning to gain a measure of independence from their families. Illness could abruptly upend their world overnight. Many common diseases that we barely give a second thought to today were potential death sentences back then. A simple cut could become infected and lead to blood poisoning, while a common cold sometimes progressed to pneumonia. With no antibiotics to combat infection, the average medieval teenager could anticipate encountering at least 3 serious illnesses before reaching adulthood. This grim reality profoundly shaped their entire perspective on life. Live for today, because tomorrow might never arrive. Out of a group of 20 novices, only 13 survived a single winter outbreak of what was likely influenza. Imagine losing 7 of your classmates in just one season. Curiously, not all illnesses affected teenagers equally. The plague, which had decimated medieval populations, seemed to disproportionately affect older adults and young children, while many teenagers survived. Conversely, a disease known as sweating sickness appeared particularly perilous to healthy teenagers and young adults. Medical records from Tudor England indicate that in one village outbreak, nearly every victim between the ages of 14 and 21 died, while many older villagers survived. The reason remained unknown then, and historians continue to debate the cause today. Medieval medical care was a peculiar amalgamation of practical knowledge, religious faith, and sheer superstition. For wealthier teenagers, being sick might entail a visit from a university-trained physician who would examine their urine, check their pulse, and then perhaps prescribe a combination of herbal remedies and bloodletting. Yes, they would deliberately make incisions to allow blood to flow out, believing this would restore balance to the body. Unsurprisingly, this often debilitated patients rather than strengthening them. Nutrition played a significant role in teenage health. While contemporary teenagers might subsist on pizza and energy drinks, medieval teens, if fortunate, ate a surprisingly varied diet. Peasant teens typically consumed a diet heavily based on grains, consisting of bread, porridge, and ale. This diet was deficient in sufficient protein and certain vital nutrients, resulting in stunted growth and diminished resistance to disease. Dental health was a particularly problematic area. Without modern toothpaste or dental care, many teenagers suffered from painful tooth decay and gum disease. Some clever teens employed frayed sticks as primitive toothbrushes, rubbing them with salt or chalk powder to clean their teeth. Others chewed herbs like mint to freshen their breath. However, by the age of 20, the average person had already lost several permanent teeth. A study of medieval skulls revealed that approximately 80% of individuals under 25 already exhibited signs of significant dental decay, and toothaches were a perpetual burden for many. Then there were the routine injuries. Modern teenagers might fracture an arm falling off a skateboard, but medieval teens faced constant physical dangers. Farm teens risked cuts from scythes, being crushed by carts, and receiving kicks from horses. Teenage apprentices suffered burns, cuts, and mangled fingers from their trades, and noble teens were not exempt. Bones discovered in noble burial grounds show frequent fractures sustained from horseback riding accidents and weapons training. One of the most captivating aspects of medieval teenage health was their remarkable resilience. Without antibiotics or modern medical interventions, their bodies developed robust immune systems. Archaeological evidence indicates that many teenagers who survived serious injuries, even compound fractures where bones broke through the skin, went on to live relatively normal lives. Girls faced additional health challenges as they reached puberty. With inadequate nutrition, the average age of first menstruation was around 15 to 16, several years later than is common today. Pregnancy and childbirth posed enormous risks for teen girls who often married young. Records from medieval England suggest that for girls under 16, the risk of dying in childbirth was nearly 25%, a terrifying prospect for young brides. Teens attempted to protect themselves from illness through various means. Many carried pouches of herbs believed to ward off disease. Others wore plague amulets, stones or crystals thought to possess magical protective qualities. During plague outbreaks, some teens carried small bouquets, posies, sort of fragrant herbs, and believing the pleasant smells would repel the bad air thought to cause disease. This practice is believed to have inspired the famous nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosy, which described plague symptoms and prevention methods. Despite the persistent threat of illness and injury, medieval teenagers were not simply passive victims of their harsh circumstances. They cultivated remarkable resilience, discovering ways to make the most of their often challenging lives. Life wasn't solely defined by labor for medieval teenagers. Despite their hardships, they discovered imaginative ways to find enjoyment and socialize. While their forms of entertainment might astonish contemporary teens who lament slow internet speeds, medieval sports bore little resemblance to today's organized games, with their emphasis on safety regulations and protective equipment. Town football matches could involve hundreds of players, with entire villages competing against each other. The playing field was typically the area between two villages, and the primary rule was simply to advance the ball to your village's goal. Broken bones were so commonplace that some towns actually prohibited football, though teenagers generally disregarded these bans. In 1314, 47 teenagers were fined for participating in an illegal football match that destroyed half a farmer's wheat field. Wrestling matches were another popular pastime, particularly at fairs and festivals. Unlike contemporary wrestling with its strict weight classes, medieval wrestling was more of an open for all. Teenagers would gather in circles, and winners would remain in the ring until defeated. Some matches lasted for hours, with participants battling through exhaustion solely for the glory of being the last one standing. There's an account of a 15-year-old apprentice named Thomas Fuller, who once wrestled for 6 consecutive hours at a summer fair, defeating 20 opponents before finally losing to his own master's son. Talk about an awkward day at work the following morning. Music and dancing played a significant role in teen social life, though perhaps not in the way one might anticipate. While noble teens learned formal courtly dances, common teenagers devised their own movements at village festivals. They created elaborate group dances where partners would frequently switch, a clever method for flirting without incurring the disapproval of watchful parents. Musicians provided accompaniment on instruments such as pipes, drums, and an instrument called a hurdy-gurdy. Some teens even formed their own musical groups, traveling between villages to perform at weddings and festivals. A record from 1389 mentions 3 teenage musicians who were arrested for playing such lively tunes that workers abandoned their duties to join in dancing. Religious festivals offered teenagers rare opportunities to momentarily disregard conventional social rules. During feast days, such as St. Nicholas Day, teens would dress up and perform in religious plays. Some particularly shrewd ones utilized these performances to mock local authorities. After all, who could reprimand them for portraying their roles with excessive enthusiasm? Taverns served as the medieval equivalent of social media hubs for working teens, particularly apprentices. After work, they would congregate to exchange stories, play dice games, and occasionally plot minor acts of mischief. A popular tavern game involved teenagers attempting to covertly steal each other's drinks without being detected. The winner received free ale while the loser was obliged to purchase a round for everyone. Tavern keepers frequently complained about teenage apprentices accruing tabs they couldn't settle, leading to some inventive payment arrangements. The streets and markets were the original places for teenagers to gather. Teenagers would assemble around market stalls, exchanging gossip and engaging in quick dice games when merchants weren't observing. Some teens became highly proficient at a game called tables and would hustle unsuspecting players. Pranks constituted a universal language among medieval teens. They would dress up as ghosts to frighten travelers, release animals into wedding feasts, or apply grease to church door handles before morning services. One particularly inventive prank from 1422 involved 3 teenage boys who trained a pig to run into the town square every time the church bells rang. It took weeks for adults to figure out the recurring phenomenon. While these pranks often resulted in punishment, they also illustrate how teenagers discovered ways to resist authority and express themselves. While medieval teenagers created these moments of enjoyment and connection, these precious instances of joy and freedom rarely endured as long as one might anticipate. The transition from being a teenager to becoming an adult in medieval times wasn't so much a gradual transition as it was an abrupt thrust off a precipice. One day you might be playing games in the village square. The next you were managing an entire household or heading off to war. Medieval society had no room for what we today term finding yourself. By the age of 14, you were expected to be found, settled, and actively engaged in whatever path life had predetermined for you. Consider the case of Thomas of Norwich. At just 14, he inherited his father's blacksmith shop following the older man's sudden illness. His diary entries dramatically shift from complaints about his father's strict rules to anxious calculations concerning iron costs and apprentice wages, all within the span of a week. His final entry as a child mentioned pilfering apples from a neighbor's tree. His first entry as an adult detailed his worries about feeding his 5 younger siblings. Girls often faced even more sudden transitions. In 1415, a merchant's daughter became the mistress of her own household at 14 through an arranged marriage. Within a year, she was overseeing servants, managing household accounts, and preparing for her first child. Her childhood trinkets were supplanted by household keys, which she wore at her belt as a symbol of her authority. The medieval equivalent of being handed the keys to your life, ready or not. For noble teenagers, the transition frequently coincided with a formal ceremony. Knighthood for boys, marriage for girls. However, this did not necessarily make the transition any easier. Young knights in training would spend their 14th year learning the harsh realities of medieval warfare. A 14-year-old squire's first battle involved assisting in collecting the dead afterward. He wrote that his hand trembled so severely he could barely grip his sword. Yet no one offered him solace. He was considered a man now, after all. The law itself designated 14 as a pivotal age. Boys could legally inherit property, enter into contracts, and be held fully accountable for criminal offenses. Girls could marry without their parents' explicit consent, and both genders could face execution for serious crimes. There's an account of a judge grappling with a case involving a 14-year-old boy caught stealing bread. The judge noted that while the boy's face still retained the softness of childhood, the law mandated he be punished as an adult. Medieval medicine considered 14 the age at which the body solidified into its adult form. Physicians would significantly alter their treatments once a patient turned 14, transitioning from gentle remedies to the full spectrum of adult medicines, including the infamous bloodletting. One medical text advised that a 14-year-old should be bled as vigorously as any adult, for their blood is now fully formed. But perhaps most striking were the emotional expectations. Medieval society believed that by 14, one should possess complete control over one's feelings. Crying, displaying fear, or admitting uncertainty were viewed as childish behaviors that needed to be shed. A knight's training manual specifically instructed that boys over 14 should be punished if they showed tears, for such weakness is unbecoming of their new station. Despite these harsh expectations, teenagers discovered ways to cope. Secret diaries and letters reveal how they preserved some aspects of childhood even while shouldering adult responsibilities. They exchanged notes during church services and carved their names into castle walls. These small acts of defiance demonstrated that even in a world that demanded instant adulthood, the teenage spirit found ways to survive. After all, medieval teens inhabited a world where time was as precious as gold, and childhood was a luxury few could afford to prolong.